It's November 18th, 1868, and a crisp, cool breeze fills the autumn air outside a crowded house in Andover, Ohio. But there is no whisper of that chill on the inside where guests pack tightly into a sitting room to watch as the man and the woman speak their vows under the guidance of the minister presiding. Schuyler Colfax is 45 years old, and he's been a widower for the past 5. His unsought singleness had provided excellent fodder for the gossipy pages of Washington's newspapers, and rumors of a new romance spread like wildfire if Colfax ever found himself in the proximity of an unaccompanied woman. But those rumors were about to be doused. Because in that home in Andover, Colfax will be married again, this time to Ellen Wade, a woman the papers will describe in remarkably dated and chauvinistic terms as about 30 years of age, of medium size, good figure, dark hair, brown eyes, and a pleasing face. Besides all of that, the bride is also the niece of Senator Benjamin Wade, possibly Colfax's greatest rival within his own Republican Party. It wasn't but a few months ago that Wade and Colfax were the two frontrunners for a prestigious nomination at the National Convention. But that's old news now, and as far as anyone else can be concerned, the rivalry is over. Schuyler Colfax won the nomination and the girl. The wedding is a small but joyous affair. The only problem is that there won't be any time for a honeymoon. There's too much work to be done, because just 2 weeks ago, Schuyler Colfax was elected Vice President of the United States of America. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series we are going to dive into the life of South Bend's own Schuyler Colfax. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's catch up with Schuyler Colfax as he navigates the fraught campaign of 1868, all the way through his one and only term as Vice President of the United States. And as impressive as a vice presidency is, let's start by acknowledging that at the beginning of 1868, it looked like Colfax might have been in line for even more. But before we get into the campaign, let's reset the political stage just a little bit. As you'll no doubt recall, President Abraham Lincoln had been killed shortly into his second term. He'd been replaced by his deeply unpopular and controversial Vice President, Andrew Johnson. Johnson was not able to appoint a new vice president because there was no vehicle to fill the position in such an event until the passage of the 25th Amendment in 1967. And yes, that does seem like the kind of political oversight that should have been fixed well before 1967. Anyway, by 1868, Johnson was impeached and faced removal from office. And since he didn't have a vice president to assume office, that meant that the president pro tem of the Senate was next in line for the presidency. And that was none other than Republican and soon-to-be Colfax in-law, Benjamin Wade. It was a complicated election cycle. The Republicans were set to choose their presidential and vice presidential candidates on May 20th, just 4 days after the historic vote that sought to remove Johnson from the White House. In short, there were a lot of moving pieces. The year had begun with whispers that Schuyler Colfax should be his party's nominee for the presidency, and newspapers across the country lionized the South Bend congressman as a man who was the truest and best, and as one who had never failed in his political pursuits. Another paper called him a man of spotless purity who had never made a mistake. The Yonkers Statesman boasted that a Colfax presidency would give the nation back what it lost in the death of President Lincoln. For his part, Colfax was, at least publicly, ambivalent about the prospect of becoming president, and even his private letters at the time seemed to point in this direction. "I intend," he said of the possibility of becoming president, "to let the whole matter drift, without lifting a finger to control the current, quite content if this great honor falls on other shoulders." In short, while he would not decline the nomination, he would not be active in seeking it. Maybe it's because he was romantic for the old times when it was considered undignified to openly campaign for the presidency. Maybe he meant it when he said he was content where he was. Or maybe it's because he was savvy enough to recognize that it just wasn't going to happen, at least not in 1868. Schuyler Colfax at the time may have been the most universally popular member of his party, but he couldn't eclipse the fame of political newcomer and indisputable hero of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was something of an unknown politically, but he was also America's greatest living war hero, and that counted for something too. Actually, it counted for quite a bit. By springtime, it was evident to all observers that Grant would be the party's nominee, and that meant that the real race would be to determine Grant's number two, the nation's vice president. At that time, the president did not select his vice president. Instead, the matter was put to a vote at the convention, and in 1868, the vote was going to be difficult and complicated. The run-up to the Republican convention was a lot of talk and bluster, but the result was a wide-open race that could go in any direction. There were four frontrunners: Reuben Fenton, governor of New York; Henry Wilson, senator from Massachusetts; and then Benjamin Wade and Schuyler Colfax. Wade was likely the most popular of the bunch, but he was also the most controversial, meaning that while there were a lot of people who were happy to vote for him, there were even more who would not vote for him under any circumstance. Well, maybe under one circumstance. If Johnson were removed from office and Wade became the sitting president, then that would probably tip the scales enough to win Wade the nomination. 4 days before the Republican convention began, the proceedings began in earnest in the Senate, and you already know that Johnson wasn't impeached because you've never heard of American President Benjamin Wade. But it was close. Remarkably close. As close as it could be. Johnson was saved by exactly one vote. And plenty of historians have argued that the reason that last vote wasn't cast was because Republican senators were wary of handing too much power to Benjamin Wade, thinking he'd be difficult to rein in later. That's how controversial he was. But that's a subject for a different podcast. Anyway, with Johnson firmly in office, the Republicans weren't faced with what would have been the absolutely wild scenario of choosing the sitting president of the United States to run for vice president in a few months. The playing field was level for the four contenders, and it was time to put the thing to a vote. There was no consensus in the first round of voting, and none of the major candidates achieved anything close to a majority. Wade had the most votes after round one, and Colfax had the fourth most votes, with a handful of minor players finishing behind him. Soon enough, those minor players would remove themselves from the race, and their votes would be cannibalized by the major players. As so often happens in situations like this one, the eventual winner wouldn't necessarily be the guy who was the most loved, but instead the one who was the least hated. Wade had just as many detractors as supporters. So did Fenton and Wilson. But it seemed that no one had an unkind thing to say about Schuyler Colfax, the congressman from South Bend. By round two, he had surged into second place, winning a few more votes each round, and even if a vote for Colfax was really a vote against one of the other guys, they all counted just the same. On May 21st, 1868, on the fifth ballot, Schuyler Colfax was named the Republican candidate for vice president, and the Grant-Colfax ticket was set. It might have seemed like a bit of an odd pairing. Grant was a political novice, Colfax as professional a politician as there was. Grant was famous for being a heavy drinker. Colfax was a teetotaler. Both men smoked like chimneys, but Colfax kept his confined to private spaces so that the public wouldn't know. Grant didn't care if the public knew. Grant had a reputation for being hard, rough, and gruff. Colfax was known for being patient, steady, and pious. But they were going to have to make the partnership work. We'll get into the presidential campaign right after the break.
Why pay more for a stylish carriage? At Coquillardon Wall, we will not be undersold. All of our wagons, carriages, and buggies are made of the best stock, fully warranted, and at prices lower than the other guys. Visit us at the northwest corner of Lafayette and Water Streets and ride back home in style. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
As soon as the dust settled on the convention, the Republican papers came out in full force to lead the charge, boasting that the Grant-Colfax ticket was the strongest the Republicans could have produced and proclaiming that victory was inevitable. The Democrats were, as to be expected, less kind. They ripped into Grant and Colfax, calling them the intellectually weakest ticket ever produced. A Cincinnati newspaper was especially vitriolic toward Colfax, saying, "Nature has been extremely limited in the bestowal of intellectual faculties to him." This kind of mudslinging was par for the course, and whether or not the people who wrote the words even believed them was a point too moot to consider. Besides, for every Democratic column that called him an idiot, there was another that besmirched him as a cunning sort of evil genius. Perhaps it's not surprising that Colfax took the brunt of the opposition's rage. He was a longtime politician with a track record that could be dissected and criticized. Grant was a war hero, beloved for his military exploits even among many of those who weren't planning on voting for him. Anyway, if they were hoping that the campaign would give them more material they could use to stain General Grant, they were going to be sorely disappointed. Grant, a political rookie who wasn't much for public speaking, was more than happy to turn the campaign over to his number two. Schuyler Colfax became the vocal half of the presidential ticket, and even though it was a race for Grant's presidency, it was Colfax's campaign. But Colfax understood the assignment, and he was deferential to Grant at every turn, despite attempts by provocateurs to drive a wedge between the two men. Colfax spoke unceasing the praises of the general, several times a day, every day, in cities and towns across the nation throughout August, September, October, and November. The campaign was a success, and the Grant-Colfax ticket won in an electoral college landslide. The Republicans had taken back the White House. Colfax had been in South Bend the night of the election, monitoring the returns as they came in across the telegraph wire. It was 11 p.m. on November 3rd by the time it was settled, and I'll let Schuyler Colfax's former newspaper, the St. Joseph Valley Register, take it from here. The enthusiasm reached its culminating point about 11 o'clock when Mr. Colfax made his appearance and was borne over the shoulders of the crowd to the judges' stand. Continuous and deafening cheers greeted the vice president-elect, and no sooner would they die away in one part of the House than they were taken up again with renewed vigor in another. The following evening there was a grand display of fireworks in honor of the success of the Republican Party. The celebration would continue for a few weeks. Colfax received congratulations from across the country for the victory, and when he was married 2 weeks later, the congratulations came in all over again. After that, it was time for a farewell address in the House of Representatives, a place Colfax had served 14 years and presided over for 6, during the most difficult, eventful, and trying years the young nation had ever seen. In appreciation for his work, a group of congressmen took up a collection to buy the speaker's chair and gifted it to Schuyler Colfax. That chair is now in the hands of the History Museum. It was a lot of transition, but now it was all settled, and there was only one thing left to do: be the Vice President of the United States. It's certainly worth noting here that, at least in some ways, the move from Speaker of the House to Vice President could actually be considered a demotion. The Speaker certainly held more power, and this wasn't lost on Colfax, who wrote way back in 1864 that except in the nearness of succession to the presidency, the speakership seems to be the more important office. But that was in 1864, before the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, when the nation experienced firsthand what happens when the wrong man holds the vice president's office. By 1868, the mood had shifted. The vice presidency was very important indeed, even if the office was little more than a political insurance policy. Anyway, that was the gig that Schuyler Colfax had now, and on March 4th, 1869, he took the oath of office, sworn in by former rival and current in-law Benjamin Wade. Now it was Colfax's full-time job to figure out what to do with his new position. The vice president did not make appointments, did not introduce legislation, did not host foreign heads of state. The vice president voted in the Senate in case of a tie. And when there weren't ties, or when Senate wasn't even in session, the constitutional responsibility of the office was remarkably small. That's not to say that Colfax was left twiddling his thumbs. Grant wasn't much for public speaking, and so there was left a vacuum for Colfax to fill. He filled it with enthusiasm, and he spent most of his first 2 years in office on the road, speaking to crowds, outlining and promoting his boss's agenda wherever and whenever he could. He wrote pieces for publication in newspapers across the nation and back in South Bend. When the Pacific Railway, once championed by Colfax in the House, was at last completed, it was a momentous national moment that deserved to be commemorated, and it was Colfax, not Grant, who gave the speech commemorating it. When it came time for someone from the White House to ride the rails for another symbolic trip out west, it was Colfax, not Grant, who made the journey. The relationship between Colfax and Grant was an unusual one, unique in American history. Grant stayed in the White House and more or less quietly did the work of the presidency. Colfax did the rest. In public, at least, Colfax was often seen as the face of the White House. It's hard to imagine a modern president with a modern ego accepting such an arrangement, but Grant knew his own strengths, and he knew the strength of his VP. The arrangement worked, at least mostly, at least for a while, and then the cracks started to show. We'll get into that after the break.
John Beitner does respectfully inform the citizens of South Bend that he has opened his new boot and shoe store with a much larger stock of boots, shoes, and gaiters for men, women, and children. Visit him at 111 Michigan Street, where he stocks only the best and warranties every shoe and boot he sells. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
Congressional historian Hubert Fuller wrote of Schuyler Colfax that he reached the pinnacle of his fame the day he was inaugurated as vice president, calling him one of the most popular men in the country, of unquestioned personal morality. Fuller goes on. He added strength to the presidential ticket, but his fall, like that of Lucifer, was tragic and bereft of hope. And yes, that does feel just a tiny bit over the top. During the second half of Grant's first term, Colfax's popularity began to wane. The strange arrangement that Grant and Colfax had settled into made easy fodder for newspapermen looking to stir up a controversy. They tried continuously to drive a wedge between the two, and even though Grant wrote with his own pen that such a wedge never existed, that didn't matter to an American public who never got to read Grant's private letters. Some faction of Republican Grant loyalists believed the chatter that Colfax was trying to usurp their hero, and when Colfax vociferously denied those allegations and offered effusive praise for Grant's presidency, he alienated the Republican wing who opposed Grant. That left Colfax in a kind of political no man's land. And in 1870, with 2 years left to go in his vice presidency, he dropped a bombshell announcement that he intended to retire from politics at the end of his term. He would not seek another vice presidential nomination, nor any public office, ever again. It's a long statement, but I'm going to read it in its entirety, because we're going to be talking about this moment a lot during the coming episodes. I intend with this term to close my public life, absolutely. I will then have had 18 years of continuous service at Washington, mostly on a stormy sea, long enough for anyone, and my ambition is all gratified and satisfied. General Grant will doubtless be renominated, and I think he should be. I shall leave public life voluntarily and without a regret, and expect to go into active business. This is the last campaign in which I will participate, and I feel happy at the prospective release from the extractions, cares, misrepresentations, and excitements of political life. Historians have revisited these words time and again, trying to read meaning into them, trying to get to the bottom of the real story here. Schuyler Colfax was not yet 50, still young for a prominent politician, and it wasn't impossible to think that there were still more opportunities for him to run for the presidency down the road. Given all that, it must have seemed that there was some ulterior motive in play, a theory only bolstered when Colfax seemed to recant of his decision a few years later. Of course, it's impossible to exactly know the mind of Schuyler Colfax at this moment, but if he really did have an ulterior motive, he kept it hidden pretty well. So I have to wonder, why not take him at his word? He's right to suggest that 18 years in national politics before, during, and after the Civil War would have been enough for anyone. He was also just recently remarried and had just celebrated the birth of his first child, a son, Schuyler Colfax III. Some reports suggest that finances played a role in the decision to step aside. With his name recognition and connections, Colfax could make a fortune in private business, far more than politics paid in the 1860s and 1870s. Maybe the presidency, the ultimate prize, just seemed too far away and too hypothetical. 6 more years as vice president just to earn the privilege to try for the higher office. 6 more years of crisscrossing the country as Grant's mouthpiece while his son grew up. Maybe he saw the presidency up close and decided he just didn't want it that bad. And if he wasn't going to be president, then what more was there to accomplish? Maybe he meant every word of that announcement. And if he could time the news in such a way as to put an end to any rumors that there was a division between himself and Grant, then that was all the better. Maybe it wasn't quite a lucerific fall from grace. Maybe he was just tired. And if he was just tired, then that would go a long way toward explaining the spell of vertigo that attacked him in the Senate chambers a year later, an incident that left him senseless and incoherent. When he returned to South Bend for a 6-week respite, it might have felt pretty good to be home. If Schuyler Colfax was just tired, it might also explain what happened next, when he returned from his sabbatical, his health restored, and his mind cleared. President Grant's Secretary of State Hamilton Fish had been in ailing health for a while, and by the summer of 1871, right around the time when Colfax arrived in Washington after his spell, Fish was determined to step down from his role. As for who might replace him, Grant had an idea. He wrote a letter to Colfax and outlined the plan. In plain English, will you give up the vice presidency to be my Secretary of State for the balance of my term in office? Give up a higher position for a lower and harder position? In all my heart, I hope you will say yes, though I confess the sacrifice you will be making. This was a big ask, and kind of an unprecedented one, but Grant was correct. The Secretary of State was a harder job, and a more powerful one. For a long time, it was the Secretary of State, not the Vice President, who was considered the successor and heir apparent to the mantle of the presidency. It was exactly the kind of thing you might expect a man to accept if he had ongoing political ambitions for a higher office. Colfax did not accept. Instead, he co-signed a letter that begged Fish to stay, and so Fish did stay, and Schuyler Colfax remained the vice president, at least for now. But as I hinted at earlier, Colfax would recant on his promise of retirement, and come 1872, there would be another campaign season. Schuyler Colfax, who had earnestly promised not to be a part of it, suddenly found himself very much in the middle of things. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in this series. Our next episode will follow Schuyler Colfax through his life after politics. I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.